Nearly 4 million barrels of Canadian oil cross into the United States every single day. They move quietly through thousands of miles of buried steel, across prairies, forests, river valleys, industrial corridors, and border crossings that most citizens never notice. These pipelines feed refineries in the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast, power freight logistics networks, stabilize heating costs during winter, and support manufacturing chains that stretch from Detroit to Houston. This is not simply a trade. It is one of the most deeply integrated energy systems anywhere in the modern world. For decades, this invisible system has functioned with minimal political drama. Contracts were signed, infrastructure was expanded, and markets adapted to the assumption that cross-border oil flows were structurally reliable. But that assumption is now being tested. In Washington, a new strategic review of U.S.-Canada oil pipeline arrangements has entered the policy conversation. Officials close to the process suggest it could involve regulatory scrutiny, national security framing, tariff exposure considerations, or long-term infrastructure oversight mechanisms. While no immediate operational changes have been confirmed, the very existence of such a review introduces uncertainty into a system designed specifically to eliminate it.
We are in active discussions with our industry about how to do that.
There is very minimal short-term ability for Canadian producers to further increase production in response to potential supply disruptions arising from the conflict in the Middle East.
Pipeline policy has rarely been used as a geopolitical pressure tool between allied economies. The fact that it is now being discussed in that context signals a shift, not necessarily in flows today, but in expectations about tomorrow. To understand why this matters, one must look beyond headlines and into the operational realities of North American energy integration.
Aiming to alleviate the immediate impacts of the disruption in markets.
The market volatility that we've seen, the dramatic price increase in just a matter of days, from $65 a barrel to almost doubling to $120, now back down a little bit, was based around the idea of a physical shortage of oil.
Much of Canada's exported crude is heavy oil originating in Alberta's oil sands. Over decades, American refiners invested billions of dollars to configure facilities capable of processing precisely that grade of supply. These investments were not short-term tactical decisions. They were structural commitments, sunk costs that assumed reliable access to Canadian feedstock for decades. Alternatives exist in theory. Oil can be moved by rail or tanker. Refineries can be modified to process different blends. Supply contracts can be renegotiated. But all of these adjustments involve time, capital, regulatory approval, and market risk. Pipeline infrastructure, once built, creates a form of industrial gravity. It pulls systems into alignment around it. This is where the sense of invisible dependency begins to emerge. Consumers rarely see it. Investors rarely talk about it openly. But policymakers understand that disruptions to foundational infrastructure can create cascading consequences far beyond energy prices alone. Freight costs, fertilizer production, petrochemical output, manufacturing margins, and currency flows can all be affected by shifts in crude supply dynamics.
I've seen more people talk about $150 to $200 happening in the not too distant future. These are analysts who are looking at it and saying 15 million barrels a day of production is missing. And that's a huge problem.
Against this backdrop, Canada's leadership response has been notably measured. Rather than escalating rhetorically, Ottawa has emphasized rules-based trade frameworks and long-term investor confidence. Mark Carney's messaging has reflected preparation rather than reaction.
This is the way the G7 oil reserve works. If you're an importer, you have to have an oil reserve. If you're an exporter, which Canada is under this government, if you have record exports, which Canada is under this government, that is how you supply the world.
Canadian officials have quietly signaled that pipeline stability remains in the interest of both economies, while also acknowledging that diversification strategies exist should structural pressures increase. This leadership contrast has shaped early perceptions of the situation.
Pipeline polls in Canada across the last 10 months since Trump was inaugurated as president down south, they're very usually, in the 70% range, what I call apple pie and motherhood kinds of numbers. And most governments don't want to be the wrong side of the 70%.
Sorry, Heather, just clarify, 70% against pipelines?
Or? In favor, yeah.
Oh, in favor of pipelines. Sorry, carry on, please.
Yeah. So usually it's not easy to be on the wrong side of that kind kind of a divide, but obviously for the BC NDP caucus and the Liberal caucus, the divide looks a little bit different. And so that has been the political challenge for Carney. So far, he's done what I would say are the lower hanging fruits, setting up the major projects office, sprinkling money here and there. But on the pipeline issue, this is obviously going to be one where he has to expend some political capital one way or the other.
In Washington, the review is being framed as a strategic evaluation of national leverage and economic resilience. In Ottawa, it is being treated as a signal that the geopolitical environment surrounding infrastructure may be entering a more uncertain phase. Neither position necessarily implies imminent confrontation. But together they create narrative tension, one side testing flexibility, the other reinforcing predictability. Markets are rarely indifferent to such signals. Following reports of potential review discussions, energy analysts began reassessing heavy crude price spreads relative to lighter benchmarks. Pipeline operators experienced periods of share volatility as investors recalibrated regulatory risk assumptions. Refining sector outlooks were quietly revised to account for possible margin pressure scenarios if transport costs or supply timing were affected. Currency traders also watched closely. The Canadian dollar has historically shown sensitivity to energy sentiment, and infrastructure headlines can influence short-term positioning even when physical flows remain unchanged. Financial markets operate on expectations. Infrastructure operates on continuity. When the two begin to diverge, tension becomes structural. At the political level, the reaction has been complex. In several U.S. states, governors with refinery exposure have raised concerns about fuel price stability and regional employment impacts. Labor organizations connected to refining and transport sectors have emphasized the importance of predictable supply conditions. Senators have debated the broader balance between asserting economic sovereignty and maintaining integrated continental trade frameworks. In Canada, provincial leaders, particularly in energy-producing regions, have reiterated calls for expanded export routes and regulatory clarity. Industry executives have warned that prolonged uncertainty could discourage capital deployment at a time when global energy competition is intensifying. Trade officials have cautioned against normalizing the politicization of infrastructure that took decades to construct. Beyond North America, international observers are also paying attention. Asian and European buyers evaluating long-term crude procurement strategies monitor these developments as indicators of future supply security. Pipeline politics in one region can influence investment decisions in another. This is how local policy debates become global strategic signals. As the situation evolves, pressure for escalation increases not because of immediate disruption, but because of systemic rigidity. Pipeline networks cannot be redesigned overnight. Refinery configurations cannot be transformed in a single fiscal quarter. Trade flows built over generations cannot be rerouted without consequences. Even a prolonged period of regulatory ambiguity can delay infrastructure upgrades, complicate financing conditions, and intensify rhetoric around resource nationalism. Companies begin hedging risk. Governments begin scenario planning. Investors begin reallocating capital. This is the moment when uncertainty transitions from narrative to structure. If you value clear geopolitical analysis that explains the systems shaping global stability, consider subscribing. Independent, calm, strategic reporting helps bring visibility to developments that often unfold quietly but carry lasting consequences. Looking ahead, 3 broad future pathways can be imagined. The first is de-escalation. Quiet diplomatic engagement could reaffirm the shared economic logic of integrated energy trade. Reviews might conclude with limited operational adjustments, allowing pipeline flows to continue largely uninterrupted. Markets would stabilize, political rhetoric would soften, and attention would shift toward other policy priorities. The second pathway involves negotiated confrontation. Washington could leverage infrastructure review processes within wider trade or industrial negotiations. Canada, in response, might pursue calibrated countermeasures, adjusting regulatory positioning, accelerating diversification strategies, or deepening infrastructure partnerships with alternative markets. Energy would become one bargaining instrument within a broader geopolitical dialogue. The third pathway is structural transformation. If tensions persist, investment could accelerate toward new pipeline corridors linking Canadian production more directly to global export terminals. American refiners might gradually explore configuration flexibility to reduce single-source dependency. Supply chains could diversify, financial exposure patterns could shift. Such changes would not occur overnight. But over time, they could reshape the economic architecture that has defined North American energy cooperation for generations. This possibility explains why current developments are being watched so closely. At its core, the story returns to the scale where it began. Millions of barrels are moving each day. Thousands of kilometers of engineered steel. Decades of industrial integration have been designed to reduce uncertainty. Pipeline systems were built to make energy predictable. They were meant to insulate markets from political cycles. Yet when infrastructure becomes part of strategic calculation, stability itself can begin to feel conditional. Citizens may not see the pipes beneath their feet. Investors may not track every valve and pump station. But leadership decisions about such systems can quietly influence the trajectory of economies. Tonight's review raises a deeper question, not only about oil flows, but about the future logic of continental cooperation. Is North America entering a phase where even its most established dependencies are open to renegotiation? If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing and joining the conversation. Thoughtful engagement helps ensure that complex geopolitical developments remain visible before they become irreversible realities.